The Eclipse Crown. Chapter 1. Shadows of VEYRATH. The sky bled crimson across jagged stone spires as Kael Draven watched Blackmere Castle burn. From his perch atop the cliffs of Mornweald, the fortress resembled a wounded beast, belching smoke and flame into the perpetual twilight that had smothered VEYRATH for generations. Distant screams carried on the wind, thin, fragile things that dissipated into the gloom like dying embers. "Another noble house falls," he murmured, his breath forming tendrils of mist in the chill air. "How many does that make this moon turn?" His companion, a gaunt man shrouded in tattered leathers, spat over the cliff's edge. "Fourth by my count. The Blackmeres lasted longer than most." Kael adjusted the worn scabbard at his hip, the once proud insignia of VEYRATH's royal knights, now deliberately defaced, deep gouges obscuring what had once been his greatest pride. The blackened steel of his pauldrons, the only pieces of his former armor he still wore, reflected nothing, as though they too had given up hope of catching light in this forsaken realm. They had children in there, Thorn. Thorn's hollow laugh held no mirth. "Children die every day in VEYRATH. What makes noble spawn more worthy of your concern?" But Kael was already descending the narrow path toward the burning castle, his hand instinctively reaching for the hilt of Sorrowbringer, the blade that had taken countless lives since he'd abandoned his knightly vows. The sword seemed to pulse beneath his fingers, hungry as always. "Sentimentality will be your end," Thorn called after him. "Your contract with Lady Mornweald specified no interference." Kael didn't turn back. The mention of Lady Seris Mornweald, with her raven hair and eyes like frozen amethysts, sent an involuntary shudder down his spine. 3 years in her service had taught him that the sorceress's beauty concealed unfathomable cruelty. Yet her gold spent, as well as any others in this ruined kingdom. As he neared the castle's outer bailey, shadows moved unnaturally along the walls, twisting against the direction of the flames. Kael slowed his approach, recognizing the telltale signs of shadow weaving, a forbidden art that only the most depraved practitioners dared to attempt. The air grew thick, filling his lungs with the metallic taste of blood and ash. Another vision seized him without warning, the 5th one this week. The world around him blurred as reality gave way to something worse. The sky splits open like a wound. 7 black towers rise from shattered earth. Countless mouths wail in unison as a crown of twisted metal descends from the void, wreathed in hungry shadows. Beneath it, a figure kneels, himself, yet not himself, hands dripping crimson, a beloved's heart clutched in his palm. When his sight cleared, Kael found himself on his knees, gauntlet hands digging into the dirt. These visions had plagued him since the Battle of Ashfall Ridge, growing more frequent, more visceral. Always the same elements: the crown, the sacrifice, the end of everything. A child's scream cut through his thoughts. Near the burning gatehouse, a small figure darted between piles of rubble, pursued by something that seemed more absence than creature, a writhing void in the shape of a man. The shadow thing moved in erratic lurches, its limbs bending at impossible angles. Kael drew Sorrowbringer. The blade's edge gleamed with an unnatural blue light, the only weapon in his experience that could harm the Shadowborn. 3 quick strides, and he intercepted the creature, swinging in a precise arc. The shadow thing shrieked as the blade cleaved through its center, a sound like glass breaking underwater. It dissolved into wisps of darkness that slithered away into the cracks between stones. The child, a girl no more than 8 years with the Blackmere house's characteristic auburn hair, stared up at him with eyes too empty for one so young. "Are there others?" Kael asked, scanning the burning courtyard. She shook her head. "They took them. The shadow people. They took everyone who didn't fight." "Who led them? Did you see?" The girl's gaze drifted to something beyond his shoulder. "The beautiful lady. The one who wears midnight." Kael spun, sword raised, but found only dancing flames and crumbling stone. Yet he knew who the child meant. Lady Seris had been here, orchestrating another house's downfall, while he and Thorn had been positioned conveniently away, watching the borders for a supposed enemy incursion that never materialized. "What's your name?" he asked, kneeling to meet the girl's hollow stare. "Elise Blackmere. Listen carefully, Elise. I'm going to take you somewhere safe. Then I need to find out where they've taken your family." The girl's small hand reached out, touching the defaced insignia on his chest. "You're the betrayer knight. The one they say murdered the prince." Kael flinched. Even after 3 years, the accusations still cut deeper than any blade. "I am Kael Draven," he said simply. "And today, I am your protector." A humorless smile crossed the child's face, making her look ancient beyond her years. No one protects anyone in VEYRATH anymore. That's what Father always said. Your father was a wise man, Kael replied, lifting her onto his hip as distant howls echoed from within the burning castle. But even wise men can be wrong. They fled through the gathering darkness as the last of Blackmere Castle collapsed behind them, adding another scar to VEYRATH's blighted landscape. In the sky above, crimson clouds parted briefly to reveal a sliver of moon, its light weak and sickly against the perpetual twilight. Kael didn't share with the child what he'd glimpsed in the castle's inner ward before they escaped. The chalk-drawn symbol of a crescent moon devouring itself, surrounded by a circle of black candles. The sign of Umbrafa, the void beneath shadows. The same symbol that had appeared in each of his visions of the apocalypse. Lady Seris wasn't just eliminating rival houses. She was working towards something far more terrifying. Something connected to the Eclipse Crown of his visions. The relic spoken of only in the most forbidden texts, said to grant dominion over all realms at a terrible price. As he carried Elise Blackmere away from her ruined home, Kael made a silent vow. He would break his contract with Lady Mornweald. He would discover what became of those taken by the shadows. And perhaps, if the gods still spared VEYRATH any attention in this age of twilight, he might even prevent the doom that haunted his dreams. But gods, like hope, had abandoned this realm long ago. Chapter 2. The Sorceress of EVERMIST. Lady Seris Mornweald stood alone in her chambers atop the northwest tower of EVERMIST Keep. Unlike the crumbling fortresses that dotted VEYRATH's landscape, her ancestral home remained untouched by decay, its obsidian walls gleaming wetly in the crimson half-light that served as day in these fallen times. She gazed into a mirror of polished black glass, watching as shadows danced across her reflection of their own accord. Her beauty remained flawless, skin like porcelain, lips the color of fresh blood, eyes shifting between violet and the deepest indigo depending on her mood. Not a single line marred her face despite her 42 years. Beauty preserved by sacrifice, power sustained by blood. "Tell me what you've seen," she commanded the mirror. The glass rippled like disturbed water, and for a moment her reflection distorted before reshaping into the visage of a hooded man with hollow eyes. The betrayer knight interfered, the shadow priest reported. He took the Blackmere child. Seris's fingers tightened around the ornate chalice she held, the blood within it sloshing dangerously close to the rim. And the others? Secured as requested. 13 nobleborn, 7 with the old bloodlines. The ritual chamber is prepared. And what of the artifact? The shadow priest hesitated. Still concealed. Our seers believe it lies beneath the morning fields, but the exact location eludes us. Seris drank deeply from the chalice, feeling the viscous liquid burn down her throat, spreading tendrils of cold fire through her veins. With each noble house that fell, with each ancient bloodline she collected, her powers grew. Soon she would locate the final piece of the puzzle, the crown itself. "Keep searching," she commanded. "The celestial alignment approaches. We have 29 days before the umbral eclipse." The shadow priest bowed. "And the knight? Shall I send the hollow ones to eliminate him?" Seris smiled, remembering Kael Draven as she had first seen him, resplendent in the royal silver and blue, the youngest knight ever to command the king's personal guard. So righteous, so incorruptible, until she had shown him how corrupt the monarchy truly was, how rotten the heart of VEYRATH had become even before the twilight descended. No, she decided. Kael still has his part to play. The prophecy is specific, the blood of one's most cherished sacrifice. And there is no sacrifice more potent than that given willingly by one who has already lost everything. Her reflection returned as the shadow priest's visage faded. Seris studied her own face, noting with satisfaction how the fresh blood had enhanced her beauty. The tiny wrinkle that had appeared near her eye that morning was gone. From a drawer in her ebony dressing table, she withdrew a small leather-bound book, its cover unmarked save for the symbol of Umbrafa embossed in faded silver. The ancient text had been in her family's possession for generations, passed from mother to daughter along with whispered warnings never to open it. Warnings her own mother should have heeded. Seris still remembered finding the woman's withered corpse, aged 100 years, in a single night after attempting to destroy the book in a fit of conscience. Seris had made no such mistake. Instead, she had embraced the knowledge within, learning the truth about the Eclipse Crown and the power it would grant its wearer. Dominion not just over VEYRATH, but all realms, seen and unseen. The price was steep, the blood of one's most cherished. But Seris had spent decades ensuring she cherished nothing and no one. She had sterilized herself in her youth to prevent maternal attachment. She had poisoned her lovers, once passion threatened to become something deeper. She had systematically exterminated her own extended family to sever all bonds of kinship. Her only weakness had been Kael Draven, the knight whose principles she had admired even as she orchestrated his downfall. For a brief moment, years ago, she had felt something dangerously close to affection for him. But she had remedied that by framing him for the murder of the young crown prince, the very child he had sworn to protect with his life. Watching his fall from grace, his transformation from honored knight to reviled outcast, had extinguished any fondness she might have harbored. Now he was merely a tool, her most effective mercenary, broken enough to obey, yet skilled enough to succeed where others failed. A distant bell told the hour. Seris closed the ancient book and returned it to its hiding place. Outside her window, the perpetual twilight had shifted toward the deeper darkness that passed for night. In the courtyard below, shadow priests led a procession of hooded figures toward the underground chambers where the noble captives awaited their fate. 29 days, she whispered to herself. 29 days until the crown is mine. She did not notice the raven watching from her windowsill, its eyes glowing with an unnatural blue light that matched the edge of a certain mercenary's sword. Chapter 3. The Sanctuary of Ashes. The Forgotten District had once been VEYRATH's crown jewel, a maze of elegant spires and marble fountains where the kingdom's artisans and scholars had dwelled in an age now remembered only in crumbling texts. Today, it was a labyrinth of ruins, its grandeur reduced to skeletal structures that clawed at the crimson sky like the hands of drowning men. This was where the discarded came to disappear. Kael navigated the treacherous streets with practiced ease, the Blackmere child silent in his arms. Occasionally, gaunt faces peered from shadowed doorways, watching their progress with hollow eyes before retreating into darkness. The fallen rarely bothered one another here. All shared the common bond of having lost everything that mattered. "Where are we going?" Elise finally asked, her voice barely audible above the perpetual moan of wind through the broken architecture. "To the only truly safe place left in VEYRATH," Kael replied. They descended a series of crumbling steps into what had once been an underground amphitheater. Decades of debris and collapse had transformed the entrance into a narrow crawlspace that would deter all but the most determined visitors. Kael set the girl down and pointed to the opening. "Can you make it through on your own?" Elise nodded and dropped to her hands and knees, crawling into the darkness without hesitation. Kael followed, his broader shoulders scraping against the rough stone. The passage widened after several yards, opening into a cavernous space illuminated by dozens of pale blue flames floating in glass spheres. The Sanctuary of Ashes. Unlike the decaying world above, the underground refuge hummed with quiet activity. Makeshift dwellings lined the curved walls of the former amphitheater. Children, a rarity in VEYRATH's twilight age, played in small groups while adults tended gardens of luminescent fungi or mended clothing. At the center, where a stage had once stood, a massive circular table held maps and scrolls. A tall woman in patched grey robes detached herself from a nearby group and approached them. Half her face bore the distinctive spiral scars of shadow burn, but her remaining eye was sharp and clear. "Twice in 1 week, betrayer?" she said, her tone making the title sound more like a jest than an accusation. "People will talk." "Hello to you too, Lysandra," Kael replied. "I've brought someone who needs sanctuary." Lysandra knelt before Elise, studying the girl's face. "Blackmere's youngest, if I'm not mistaken. We heard about the attack." She looked up at Kael. "The others?" "Taken. Not killed, according to Elise." "Taken where?" "That's what I intend to find out." Lysandra stood, brushing dust from her robes. "You'd risk Lady Mornweald's wrath? I thought you were still bound by contract." "Some contracts deserve to be broken." The scarred woman's lip curled into a half-smile. "Ever the knight, despite everything." She turned to the girl. "Come, child. Let's find you something to eat and a place to rest." As Lysandra led Elise away, a stooped figure emerged from the shadows, an elderly man with skin like parchment, wrapped in robes that might once have been the rich blue of a royal scholar. Around his neck hung a pendant of clouded crystal. "Archivist," Kael acknowledged with a slight bow. Valerian, once chief archivist to 3 successive kings of VEYRATH, motioned for Kael to follow him to a secluded alcove where ancient books were stacked in precarious towers. The old man's hands trembled as he sifted through a pile of loose parchment, finally extracting a piece covered in spidery script. "The symbol you described," Valerian said, his voice a dry whisper. "It belonged to the cult of Umbrafa, worshippers of the void that hungers. They were thought extinct after the purge of shadows 3 centuries ago. Clearly they've returned, Kael replied. And Lady Seris leads them. Not leads. Serves. Valerian tapped a faded illustration, showing a crowned figure seated on a throne of twisted bones. Umbrafa requires vessels. Powerful sorcerers willing to channel its essence into our realm. If Lady Mornweald has taken this role, then what's happening to the noble houses is no mere power struggle. It's preparation, Kael murmured. But for what? The old archivist's eyes widened. You've been touched by prophecy. It wasn't a question, but a declaration delivered with equal parts awe and dread. Kael tensed. I've been having episodes, glimpses of a future I don't understand. Valerian's trembling hands retrieved a tattered scroll from beneath a pile of mouldering books. As he unrolled it, Kael recognized the same symbol from Blackmere Castle, the crescent moon devouring itself. The Eclipse Crown is the physical manifestation of Umbrafa's power, Valerian explained. Forged in the First Age from metal not of this world. When worn during the umbral eclipse, a convergence that occurs once every 7 centuries, it grants its bearer dominion over all realms. At what cost? Kael asked, already suspecting the answer. The dearest blood. Valerian's finger traced words in a language Kael couldn't read. To claim the crown's power, one must sacrifice that which they cherish most. Not just their death, but by the wearer's own hand. Kael's mind flashed to his vision, himself kneeling, a heart in his bloody hands. And this umbral eclipse? When is it due? 29 days from now. The archivist's expression grew grave. We've all sensed the signs. The deepening of the twilight, the unnatural movements of shadows, the whispers in the dark corners of dreams. Lady Mornweald isn't just collecting noble bloodlines for power. She's preparing for the ritual to claim the crown. Then I need to find where she's keeping the captives and free them before she can complete whatever ceremony she's planning. Kael turned to leave, but Valerian's bony fingers clutched at his arm with surprising strength. There's more you should know, the old man insisted. The crown itself was broken and scattered during the last umbral eclipse. For fragments, each hidden by the ancient orders. Then Lady Seris can't complete the ritual without finding all the pieces. Precisely. And I fear she's closer than we realize. 3 noble houses with guardian bloodlines have fallen in the past month. Understanding dawned on Kael. She's not just taking hostages, she's extracting information about the crown fragments. Under terrible torture, I suspect. Valerian nodded grimly. Only those of the old bloodlines would know the hiding places, passed down through generations as seemingly insignificant family lore. Kael thought of little Elise Blackmere. Had her family been guardians of one such fragment? Was that knowledge now encoded in innocent bedtime stories, or family traditions the child had never recognized as significant? I need to speak with the girl again, he said. Valerian shook his head. She's sleeping, the first real rest she's likely had since the attack. Let her be for now. He reached into his robes and withdrew a small leather pouch. Take this instead. Kael accepted the pouch, loosening the drawstring to reveal a small, smooth stone that emitted a faint blue luminescence, the same color as the edge of his sword. Starfall steel, he murmured, recognizing the rare material. Like Sorabringer's edge. The only substance that can harm beings of shadow, Valerian confirmed. This piece is attuned to the largest concentration of its kind. It will grow warmer as you approach. And you believe this will lead me to one of the crown fragments. The ancient orders weren't fools. They ensured each fragment was encased in starfall steel, both to contain its power and to repel Umbrafa's servants. The archivist's eyes gleamed with sudden intensity. Find even one fragment before Lady Seris, and you may disrupt her plans long enough for us to devise a more permanent solution. Kael slipped the pouch inside his leather jerkin. I'll leave at first light. There is no first light anymore, Kael Draven, Valerian said softly. Only varying shades of darkness. As he turned to depart, Kael noticed a lone figure watching from the shadows of a distant archway. Thorn, his face unreadable beneath the hood of his cloak. The tracker had followed him, despite explicit instructions to maintain their post at morn watch. The question was whether he had done so out of concern, or to report back to Lady Seris. Either way, Kael's path forward had just become considerably more complicated. Chapter 4, Whispers in the Dark. Thorn was waiting when Kael emerged from the archivist's alcove. The tracker leaned against a crumbling column, methodically cleaning beneath his fingernails with the tip of a slender knife. Didn't expect to find you here. Kael kept his voice neutral, his hand casually resting on Sorabringer's hilt. Didn't expect to follow you here, Thorn countered. Yet here we are, both surprised. He sheathed his knife with a practiced flick. You broke contract. I saved a child. Same difference to Lady Mornweald. Thorn pushed away from the column, his hollow face showing no hint of his intentions. She doesn't allow deviations from her instructions. Are you here to collect my head then? Kael's fingers tightened around his sword's grip. Thorn's laugh was sudden and harsh. If I wanted you dead, betrayer, I wouldn't announce myself. He glanced around the chamber, at the refugees who had built a semblance of life in this underground sanctuary. I've never seen so many children in one place since the twilight descended. Is that why you followed me? Curiosity? I followed you because Lady Seris ordered me to shadow you these past 6 months. To report your movements, your conversations, your episodes. Thorn tapped his temple. Those visions you've been having. She's very interested in them. Cold realization washed over Kael. She's been watching me all this time. Not just watching. Testing. Pushing you towards specific assignments, specific houses. Thorn's voice dropped lower. I've seen what happens after the assignments are complete. What they do to the nobles they capture. It's not clean, Draven. Why tell me this now? Thorn's hollow face hardened. Because I've seen where this ends. He pulled back his sleeve, revealing an arm covered in strange markings. Black swirls that seemed to move beneath his skin like living shadow. I'm marked. The shadow priests did this when I first entered her service. It lets them listen through me, see through me, when they choose to look. Then why risk speaking against her now? Because they're not looking. Not tonight. Thorn's eyes gleamed with something like fear, an emotion Kael had never seen in the hardened tracker. Something bigger has their attention. Some ritual with the Blackmere captives is happening at EVERMIST Keep. That's why I can tell you this much. They're distracted by blood and screaming. The starfall stone against Kael's chest pulsed with sudden warmth. The Blackmeres, Kael said. They must have known something about one of the crown fragments. Thorn's expression showed no surprise at the mention of the relic. So you know about the crown? He nodded slowly. There's a hidden way into EVERMIST, a passage through the old sewers that emerges in the east wing. The shadow priests never patrol there. The water disrupts their form. You're helping me infiltrate Lady Seris's stronghold. Kael could scarcely believe what he was hearing. I'm helping myself, Thorn corrected. The shadow marks are spreading. Soon there will be more of them than me inside this skin. I've seen others consumed entirely. His hand drifted to a vial hanging from his belt, a potion of some kind. I've procured my own escape. But before I take it, I wanted to balance the scales. By betraying your mistress. By choosing which betrayal I can live with. Thorn reached into his cloak and withdrew a folded piece of parchment. The patrol schedules for EVERMIST. The location of the ritual chambers. You'll find them in the northwest tower's lowest level. Kael accepted the parchment cautiously. Why should I trust you? You shouldn't. But you're desperate, and I'm dying. Thorn's smile was ghastly in the dim light. We're both betrayers now, Knight. The only difference is you still think your honor can be reclaimed. Before Kael could respond, a commotion erupted at the sanctuary's main entrance. Lysandra rushed past them, barking orders to seal the emergency exits. Refugees scattered to defensive positions with practiced efficiency. We've been compromised, she shouted as she passed. Shadow priests at the upper entrance. Thorn's face drained of what little color it had. They followed me. The marks, they must have activated them remotely. He clutched at his tattooed arm as the black swirls began to pulse and writhe beneath his skin. Get out. Get everyone out. I can't. His words choked off as his body contorted unnaturally. Shadow began to seep from his eyes and mouth like black tears and spittle. Kael drew Sorrowbringer, the blade's edge glowing fiercely in response to the shadow magic. Fight it, Thorn. But the tracker was already lost. His form buckled and twisted as shadow consumed him from within, reshaping his body into something inhuman. Where Thorn had stood moments before, a shadow thing now writhed. Humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its head cocked at an impossible angle. It lunged at Kael with unnatural speed. Sorrowbringer sliced through the air, its starfall edge leaving a trail of blue light. The blade connected with the shadow thing's shoulder, passing through with minimal resistance. Black ichor sprayed from the wound, sizzling where it touched the ground. The creature that had been Thorn shrieked, a sound like shattering glass, and retreated, its wounded limb dangling uselessly. It regarded Kael with eyes that had become black pits, recognition still lingering somewhere in their depths. Run! It gurgled through a mouth no longer designed for human speech, before dissolving into a pool of writhing shadow that slithered away toward the entrance, where sounds of combat had already erupted. Kael rushed after it, emerging into the main chamber to find chaos. A dozen shadow priests had breached the sanctuary, their elongated forms gliding between columns as they pursued fleeing refugees. Lysandra stood at the center of the chamber, wielding two short swords whose edges glowed with the same blue light as Sorrowbringer. "Get the children out through the western tunnel," she called to Kael as she severed a shadow priest's arm. "We'll hold them here. What about you? We've survived worse." She spun, decapitating another attacker. "The Blackmere girl is with Valerian. Find them. They'll need your protection more than we will." Kael cut down a shadow priest that loomed over a fallen refugee, then made his way toward the archivist's alcove. He found it empty, books and scrolls scattered across the floor, as if Valerian had left in a hurry. A splash of blood marked the wall beside a hidden door, now ajar. Following the passage beyond, Kael descended a narrow stairwell that spiraled deeper beneath the city. The sounds of fighting faded, replaced by the steady drip of water and, ahead, hushed voices. He turned a corner to find Valerian and Elise huddled beside a subterranean stream that cut through the cavern floor. "They found us," the archivist whispered unnecessarily, clutching a bleeding wound on his arm. "How did they find us?" "They followed Thorn," Kael explained. "Or rather, they were inside him. Shadow marks." Valerian's face paled. "Then they know everything he knew. Our defenses, our escape routes." He clutched Elise closer. "We need to move quickly. The western tunnel will be the first place they look if they extracted that knowledge from Thorn," Kael finished. "We need another way out." The starfall stone against his chest had grown uncomfortably warm, nearly burning against his skin. He withdrew it from its pouch to find it glowing brightly, pulsing like a heartbeat. "It's never reacted like this before," Valerian said, staring at the stone with wide eyes. Kael turned slowly, following the direction in which the pulsing intensified. The stone's light grew strongest when pointed downstream, along the underground waterway. "The fragment, it must be nearby." Valerian's expression shifted from fear to determination. "Of course. The Mornwater. It runs beneath both the city and EVERMIST Keep. The perfect hiding place for an artifact that shadow creatures cannot approach." "We follow the stream, then," Kael decided. "It may lead us both to safety and to the fragment." "The current is too strong for an old man and a child," Valerian objected. Kael knelt beside Elise, who had remained eerily calm throughout the chaos. "Do you know how to swim, Elise Blackmere?" The girl nodded, her eyes reflecting the blue glow of the starfall stone. "Father insisted all his children learn. He said the water might save us when everything else failed." A chill ran down Kael's spine at her words. "Your father was wiser than he knew." He turned to Valerian. "Can you make it to the eastern outpost on your own? Through the catacombs?" The archivist straightened with dignity. "I was navigating these tunnels before you were born, Betrayer Knight. The girl should go with you. She'll only slow me down in the narrow passages." From the tunnel behind them came the unmistakable sounds of pursuit, the whisper slide of shadow priests moving through darkness. There was no more time for debate. "Stay alive, old man," Kael said, clasping Valerian's arm briefly. "We'll need your knowledge before this is over." "And you, Kael Draven," the archivist replied solemnly. "Remember that prophecy chooses its vessels carefully. Your visions are no accident." He pressed something small and cold into Kael's palm, a key of strange design. "For the waters beneath EVERMIST. If you find what's hidden there." Before Kael could ask more, Valerian slipped away into a side passage, moving with surprising agility for one so aged. Kael lifted Elise into his arms and waded into the subterranean stream. The girl clung to his neck as the frigid water rose to his chest. "Hold your breath when I tell you," he instructed, feeling the current's pull growing stronger. Ahead, the stream disappeared into a low tunnel barely large enough for a man to pass through. "And whatever happens, don't let go of me." Elise nodded, her small face solemn in the blue glow of the starfall stone. Behind them, shadows began to pour into the chamber they had just left. "Now," Kael commanded, taking a deep breath as he surrendered to the current. The ice-cold water swept them into darkness, away from the sanctuary, away from the shadows, and toward the heart of EVERMIST Keep, where Lady Seris awaited with blood on her hands and ambition in her heart. Chapter 5. Beneath the Waters. Darkness and the roar of rushing water enveloped them as the current dragged them through the subterranean passage. Kael kept one arm locked around Elise's small form, while the other groped blindly along the rough stone ceiling, searching for air pockets. His lungs burned, his body numbed by the frigid water. Just as his vision began to dim at the edges, the tunnel widened and the ceiling disappeared. Kael kicked upward, breaking the surface with a desperate gasp. Beside him, Elise emerged coughing but alive, her fingers still tangled in the straps of his leather jerkin. They had been swept into a vast underground chamber where the stream widened into a black, mirror-smooth lake. Phosphorescent fungi clung to the cavern walls, casting everything in an eerie blue-green glow. The air hung heavy with mist and the earthy scent of still water. "Can you swim to shore?" Kael asked, treading water. Elise nodded, already moving with confident strokes toward the nearest bank, where a narrow strip of sand gleamed pale in the fungal light. Kael followed, scanning the shadowed recesses of the cavern for signs of danger. Once on land, he wrung water from his cloak while Elise huddled nearby, remarkably composed for a child who had lost everything mere hours ago. The girl's capacity for stoicism unnerved him more than tears would have. "Do you know where we are?" he asked her, retrieving the starfall stone from his pouch. It still pulsed with blue light, but more faintly now, as if confused by their surroundings. "The deep dark," Elise replied without hesitation. "Father brought me here once, on my 7th naming day. He said our family has always been caretakers of the waters." Kael studied her with renewed interest. "What else did your father tell you about this place?" The girl's eyes reflected the ghostly illumination as she gazed across the subterranean lake. "That we must never disturb what sleeps beneath. That shadows cannot touch the sacred waters. That when twilight falls forever, the waters would remember the light." Familiar phrases, but twisted into children's tales, exactly as Valerian had suggested. The noble houses had disguised their ancient duties as family traditions, passing the knowledge to their children in the form of stories and superstitions. "And did he show you anything special while you were here? A secret place, perhaps?" Elise nodded, pointing toward a narrow fissure in the far wall, barely visible in the dim light. "The Weeping Lady. Father prayed there, though he told me not to watch." Kael helped her to her feet. "Can you take me to this Weeping Lady?" They followed the shoreline, picking their way across slippery rocks and around massive stalagmites that rose like the teeth of some primordial beast. As they approached the fissure Elise had indicated, Kael felt the starfall stone grow warmer against his chest, its pulsing more insistent. The opening was smaller than it had appeared from a distance, barely wide enough for Kael to squeeze through sideways. Beyond lay a small grotto where crystal formations caught and amplified the faint light, transforming it into shimmering rainbows that danced across the walls. At the center stood a statue carved from some luminous white stone, a woman with her head bowed, hands cupped before her as if offering something that had long since been taken away. Water trickled from her eyes, running down her cheeks to collect in a small basin at her feet. "The Weeping Lady," Elise whispered reverently. Kael approached the statue, drawn by both the intensifying pulse of the starfall stone and an inexplicable sense of recognition. Though the face was partially obscured by a stone veil, something in the figure's posture stirred a memory he couldn't quite grasp. "What did your father do here?" he asked, circling the statue. "He knelt before her and spoke words I didn't understand. Then Elise's brow furrowed. He cut his hand and let the blood mix with her tears. Blood of the guardian bloodlines. Of course. Kael drew his dagger and, before he could reconsider, sliced his palm. The pain was sharp but familiar. A knight's hands were never strangers to blood. He held his bleeding hand over the basin, allowing several drops to fall into the collected tears. Nothing happened. "It must require Blackmere blood," he muttered, turning to Elise. But the girl shook her head. "No. Father said the lady knows all who come with pure intent. But you must give her your true name." "My name is Kael Draven." "Your true name," Elise insisted. "The one that matters to her." Kael stared at the statue, at its downcast face that seemed to hold both sorrow and dignity. An impossible thought struck him, one so outlandish he almost dismissed it. Yet the starfall stone urged him forward, its heat now nearly unbearable against his skin. He knelt before the Weeping Lady and whispered, "I am the betrayer knight, falsely accused. I seek redemption through service to the light that was." The effect was immediate. The water in the basin began to glow with the same blue radiance as the starfall stone. The statue's tears changed from clear to luminescent, running down her stone cheeks like liquid starlight. The cupped hands, empty for centuries, now cradled a small object that materialized from the very air. A fragment of twisted metal that gleamed with an inner darkness despite the light surrounding it. One piece of the Eclipse Crown. Kael reached for it instinctively, only to snatch his hand back as pain lanced through his fingers. Even from inches away, the fragment radiated a cold so intense it burned. "You cannot touch it directly," Elise said, her voice suddenly different, deeper, older. When Kael turned to her, the girl's eyes glowed with the same blue light as the basin. "No mortal flesh can bear the crown's touch without protection. Elise, the child sleeps. I speak through her by ancient right. I am the guardian spirit bound to the Blackmere bloodline." The girl's small face remained impassive, but the voice emanating from her had the weight of centuries behind it. "You have been marked by prophecy, Betrayer Knight. Your visions are true." Kael's throat tightened. "Then I will bring about the end. I will be the one to spill beloved blood. All prophecies contain branching paths. What you have seen is but one possibility." The entity using Elise's voice gestured toward the fragment. "Take the key given to you by the archivist. It will provide the means to transport what cannot be touched." With trembling fingers, Kael withdrew Valerian's key from his pouch, an intricate thing of twisted metal that matched the fragment's strange design. As if responding to its proximity, the key began to unwind itself, reshaping into a small cage just large enough to contain the crown piece. "Place it around the fragment," the guardian spirit instructed. Kael carefully positioned the cage around the fragment, without touching the relic itself. The moment the cage closed around it, the crown piece lost its burning aura, becoming simply an object, albeit one of disturbing aspect, its metal surfaces seeming to absorb rather than reflect the surrounding light. "The fragment is secure for now," the spirit continued, "but its call will draw the servants of Umbrafa. You must take it far from here, beyond Lady Mornweald's reach." "What about the other pieces?" "3 remain scattered. One in the barren mountains where kings are laid to rest. One beneath the sea where no light penetrates. And one," the spirit hesitated, "one already in the sorceress's possession, taken from the Calder bloodline 3 nights past." "Then she's halfway to completing the crown," Kael said grimly. "Yes, but the ritual cannot proceed without all 4 fragments. You have bought precious time." The glow in Elise's eyes began to fade. "The child returns. She will remember nothing of our exchange." "Wait," Kael reached toward her. "The prophecy. Am I truly meant to sacrifice someone I love? The prophecy speaks of the dearest blood freely given. The interpretation is yours to make, Betrayer Knight." The spirit's voice grew fainter. "But know this. Lady Seris believes she has circumvented the requirement by purging herself of all attachments. She is mistaken. The crown demands true sacrifice, not clever evasions." The blue light vanished from Elise's eyes, and the girl swayed on her feet. Kael caught her before she could fall, the caged fragment clutched carefully in his other hand. "What happened?" Elise asked groggily. "I feel strange." "You helped me find what we were looking for," Kael said, tucking the caged fragment into an inner pocket of his jerkin. "Now we need to leave this place quickly." As if in response to his words, a distant wailing echoed through the cavern, the unmistakable hunting cry of shadow priests. They had found the underwater passage. "This way," Elise said, suddenly alert again. She scrambled through the narrow fissure with the nimbleness of youth. Kael followed, emerging back into the main cavern in time to see dark shapes moving across the subterranean lake. Shadow priests gliding just above the water's surface, their elongated limbs trailing ripples in the black mirror beneath them. "They cannot touch the water, but they can pass over it," Kael muttered. "Clever." He scanned the cavern, noting a steep tunnel on the far side that appeared to lead upward. If his sense of direction hadn't failed him, that passage might take them beneath EVERMIST Keep, potentially to the same dungeons where the other Blackmeres were being held. It was a desperate gamble, but with shadow priests closing in from behind and no other apparent exit, options were limited. "Can you run?" he asked Elise. The girl nodded, her face set with determination beyond her years. "Then run." Kael drew Sorrowbringer, its blue edge flaring brighter than ever in response to the approaching shadows. "And don't look back no matter what you hear." They raced along the shoreline, splashing through shallow pools and vaulting over low stalagmites. Behind them, the shadow priests altered course, abandoning their methodical search pattern to give pursuit. Halfway to the tunnel, Kael realized they wouldn't reach it before being overtaken. He stopped abruptly, spinning to face their pursuers. "Keep going," he shouted to Elise. "Wait for me at the tunnel entrance." 3 shadow priests glided toward him, their featureless faces somehow conveying hunger despite the absence of recognizable expressions. They moved together with unnatural coordination, spreading out to flank him from multiple angles. Kael centered his breathing, falling into the combat stance that had been drilled into him since childhood. Sorrowbringer hummed in his grip, eager for shadow flesh. The first priest lunged, its elongated arms stretching impossibly to claw at him from 15 feet away. Kael sidestepped, bringing his blade down in a precise arc that severed the shadowy limbs. The creature recoiled, its substance oozing black ichor where the starfall edge had touched it. The second and third attacked simultaneously, one from above, dropping from a stalactite with silent grace, the other scuttling low across the ground like some obscene insect. Kael rolled beneath the airborne attacker, coming up behind it to thrust Sorrowbringer through its core. The blade emerged from the Shadow Priest's chest, trailing wisps of darkness that dissipated like smoke. The third priest caught him with a glancing blow, its claws raking across his shoulder and drawing blood. Pain lanced through Kael's arm, but he forced himself to ignore it, pivoting to face the creature head-on. This Shadow Priest was different from the others. Larger, more substantial, with a hint of human features still visible beneath the corruption. Recognition struck Kael like a physical blow. Thorn. The shadow thing hesitated, its advance faltering. Something like recognition flickered across its barely human face. Draven. It rasped, the word distorted but unmistakable. Kill. Me. Kael's grip tightened on Sorrowbringer. I'm sorry, my friend. Not. Friend. The thing that had been Thorn managed. Just. Less. Enemy. With a final, jerking movement that seemed to require immense effort, the shadow thorn impaled itself on Kael's outstretched blade. Blue light erupted where Starfall's steel met corrupted flesh, spreading through the creature's body like wildfire through dry brush. As it dissolved around the blade, a human hand, the last truly human part of Thorn, pressed something into Kael's palm. Then it was gone, leaving only scattered wisps of shadow that faded like bad memories. Kael looked down at the object Thorn had given him. A small iron key attached to a ribbon of faded red silk. Engraved on its head was the symbol of EVERMIST's dungeons, a gift more valuable than gold in their current circumstances. More shadow priests were crossing the lake now, at least a dozen moving with unhurried confidence. They knew their quarry was cornered. Kael sprinted toward the tunnel where Elise waited, his wounded shoulder throbbing with each step. Come on, he said, taking her hand as he reached her. And stay close to the walls. They'll have sentries posted inside. Together they ascended the tunnel, leaving the relative safety of the sacred waters behind and climbing steadily toward the heart of enemy territory. EVERMIST Keep, stronghold of Lady Seris Mornweald and center of the gathering darkness that threatened to consume what remained of VEYRATH's twilight world. Chapter 6, EVERMIST Keep. The tunnel narrowed as it ascended, forcing them to proceed in single file. Kael led the way, one hand trailing along the damp stone wall, while the other remained ready to draw Sorrowbringer at the first sign of danger. The starfall stone against his chest had cooled to a comfortable warmth, its pulsing reduced to an occasional flutter now that they carried the crown fragment. Behind him, Elise moved with surprising stealth for a child, placing her feet carefully to avoid loose stones. Neither had spoken since entering the passage. Words seemed dangerous in this lightless crawl toward uncertainty. After what felt like hours but was likely less than one, Kael detected a change in the air. A shift from the damp mineral scent of the caverns to something mustier, tinged with smoke and the faint metallic tang of blood. They were nearing EVERMIST Keep. The passage ended abruptly at a rusty grate set into the floor of what appeared to be a storage cellar. Rows of wine racks lined the walls, though many stood empty. Barrels were stacked haphazardly in corners, some leaking contents that glistened black in the dim light provided by a single guttering torch. Kael pressed his face to the grate, scanning the cellar for movement. Finding none, he tested the iron bars. They shifted slightly, suggesting the grate wasn't secured from above. I'm going to lift this, he whispered to Elise. Stay here until I'm certain it's safe. He pressed his shoulder against the grate and pushed upward. The iron shrieked in protest, much louder than Kael had anticipated. He froze, listening for any response from within the cellar. Silence. With a final shove, he dislodged the grate completely and pulled himself up into the cellar. The air was noticeably colder here, carrying a chill that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the malevolence that permeated EVERMIST Keep. After confirming the room was indeed empty, Kael helped Elise up through the opening. She looked even smaller in the torch's unsteady light, her face streaked with dirt and dried tears. Yet her eyes remained clear and focused, the eyes of a survivor. We need to find where they're keeping your family, Kael said softly. Thorn's map suggests the dungeons are beneath the northwest tower, but we'll need to move carefully. This place will be heavily guarded. Not by people, Elise responded with certainty. The beautiful lady doesn't trust people. Only shadows. Kael nodded grimly. And that might give us an advantage. Shadow priests avoid light and water. They prefer darkness and dry places. He moved to the cellar door, testing its handle. Unlocked. Stay close to me. If I tell you to run or hide, you do it without question. Understood? Elise nodded solemnly. They slipped from the cellar into a narrow servants' corridor lit by widely spaced wall sconces. The keep's inner architecture reflected its mistress's nature, all sharp angles and abrupt transitions, designed to disorient rather than welcome. Tapestries depicting brutal historical scenes hung between windows of stained glass, so dark they admitted little of the crimson twilight from outside. Using Thorn's crude map as a guide, they navigated through the lower levels of EVERMIST, ducking into alcoves or empty rooms whenever footsteps approached. The few human servants they glimpsed moved with downcast eyes and hurried steps, their faces bearing the hollow look of those who had witnessed horrors beyond bearing. As they neared the northwest tower, the temperature dropped further. Frost rimmed the stones beneath their feet, crunching softly with each step. Ahead, two massive iron doors marked the entrance to the tower's lower levels. The dungeons lie beyond, Kael whispered, examining the lock. He withdrew Thorn's iron key, relieved to find it matched the keyhole. But something's wrong. There are no guards. Maybe they don't need guards, Elise suggested, pointing to strange markings carved into the floor around the doorway. Symbols similar to those that had covered Thorn's skin before the shadow priests claimed him completely. Shadow wards, Kael muttered, designed to alert the priests if anyone unauthorized crosses them. He studied the patterns, noting how they formed concentric circles around the entrance. We need to disrupt them somehow. He reached for his water skin, remembering how the shadow priests had avoided touching the subterranean lake. Water might weaken them. No, Elise said, her voice suddenly distant. Not water. Blood. Kael looked at her sharply. What makes you say that? I remember now. When the shadow people came for us, Father tried to stop them. He cut his hand and let the blood fall on marks like these. Her eyes took on a faraway look. It made them angry. The marks turned red and then black, and then they were gone. Blood of the old bloodlines, Kael mused. It must disrupt their magic. He was reluctant to use the child's blood, but his own likely wouldn't have the same effect. Before he could decide, Elise had already drawn a small silver pin from her hair, an heirloom piece bearing the Blackmere crest. Without hesitation, she pricked her finger and squeezed a drop of blood onto the nearest shadow ward. The effect was instantaneous. The mark hissed and smoked, the carved lines writhing as if in pain before crumbling to ash. One by one, the connecting symbols failed, spreading outward from the point of contact like a wave of disintegration. Quickly, Kael urged, inserting Thorn's key into the lock. It turned with surprising ease, and the massive doors swung inward on silent hinges, too silent for such ancient iron. Beyond lay a circular chamber illuminated by brackish green light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The air hung thick with the coppery scent of fresh blood. At the center stood a stone altar, its surface stained dark with dried fluids. Around it, arranged in a perfect circle, were 13 iron cages, each barely large enough for a person to stand upright. 12 of the cages contained hunched figures in varying states of consciousness. The 13th stood empty, its door ajar. Father, Elise cried, rushing forward before Kael could stop her. Lord Blackmere occupied the nearest cage, his once proud frame now crumpled against the bars. At the sound of his daughter's voice, he raised his head, revealing a face transformed by torture. One eye swollen shut, teeth missing, skin marked with strange symbols that mirrored the shadow wards outside. Elise, he croaked, his voice barely audible. No, you shouldn't be here. Kael approached cautiously, scanning the room for traps or hidden guardians. We're here to free you, Lord Blackmere. All of you. Too late, another prisoner whispered, a woman whose cage bore the crest of House Calder. We've already told her everything. The fragments. The hiding places. She has 2 pieces now, Lord Blackmere confirmed, gripping the bars of his cage with bloodied fingers. The Calder fragment and ours. Cold dread settled in Kael's stomach. What do you mean? We recovered the Blackmere fragment from the Weeping Lady's grotto. Blackmere's laugh was hollow and terrible. A decoy. A clever ruse my ancestors devised. The real fragment was hidden in plain sight, passed from father to firstborn for generations. His remaining eye fixed on Elise. In the Blackmere signet ring, Kael turned to the girl, who had gone deathly pale. "Elise, do you have this ring?" She shook her head, tears forming. "Alistair has it. My brother. He's the heir." "And where is your brother now?" "With her," Lord Blackmere whispered. "In the ritual chamber above. She's been preparing him." His voice broke on the last word. Kael drew Sorrowbringer, its blue edge casting strange shadows across the dungeon. "I'll find him, and then I'll return for all of you." "No." Lord Blackmere reached through the bars, clutching Kael's wrist with surprising strength. "You must get Elise away from here. The ritual. It requires the blood of innocence from each guardian bloodline. That's why she's kept us alive, to harvest our blood for the ceremony." "And your son?" "Beyond saving," Blackmere said, his voice thick with grief. "They've hollowed him out, put something else inside. Something. Hungry." Elise sobbed quietly, her small shoulders shaking. Kael placed a comforting hand on her head, his mind racing. If Lady Seris already had 2 fragments, and the third was hidden beyond his reach beneath the sea, then the decoy fragment they'd recovered from the Weeping Lady was their only advantage. "How much time before the ritual begins?" he asked, addressing all the prisoners. "When the crimson moon reaches its zenith," the colder woman replied. "Within the hour. Then we haven't a moment to lose." Kael examined the cage locks, finding them simple enough to pick with his dagger. "I'm getting you all out of here." "And going where?" Lord Blackmere asked bitterly. "We're in the heart of EVERMIST Keep. There's no escape." "The passage we used to enter," Kael explained as he worked on the first lock. "It leads to the subterranean lake, then to the sanctuary. If you can reach the water, the shadow priests won't follow." One by one, he freed the prisoners, representatives from each of VEYRATH's oldest noble houses, now reduced to broken shells of their former selves. Some could barely stand, while others bore marks of torture that went beyond physical into the realm of spiritual violation. "You'll need to help each other," Kael instructed as the last cage opened, the strongest supporting the weakest. "Make for the cellar with the floor grate. Follow the tunnel to the lake. Swim to the far shore and continue until you reach the Sanctuary of Ashes." "What about you?" asked a frail man bearing the crest of House Varen. "I'm going after the Blackmere heir," Kael replied, "and the fragment he carries." "Suicide," Lord Blackmere said flatly. "The ritual chamber will be guarded by her most powerful servants." "Perhaps, but I have something they don't expect." Kael patted the pocket containing the caged decoy fragment. "Sometimes a distraction is all one needs to turn the tide of battle." Lord Blackmere stared at him with his one good eye, recognition dawning. "You're him, aren't you? The betrayer knight. The one who killed the prince." "I am Kael Draven," he replied evenly. "And I never laid a hand on Prince Aldrich. That was Lady Seris's doing, her way of removing me from the royal court when I began to suspect her true nature." "Then you serve no one now." "I serve VEYRATH. What's left of it?" Kael turned to Elise, kneeling to meet her eyes. "Go with your father. Help him reach the sanctuary." The girl threw her arms around his neck, holding tight for a brief moment. "Don't die," she whispered fiercely. "Promise." "I promise to try very hard not to," he replied, the closest thing to honesty he could offer. As the prisoners filed out, supporting each other as instructed, Kael consulted Thorn's map one last time. The ritual chamber was marked at the top of the northwest tower, a space labelled simply, her sanctum, in the tracker's cramped handwriting. Kael took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. The fragment in his pocket felt heavier than its size suggested, as if the metal itself resented being moved. The starfall stone against his chest had grown warm again, perhaps sensing the proximity of the 2 authentic fragments somewhere above. He'd lost everything once before, his honor, his position, his future. He had nothing left to sacrifice except his life. And if that was what it took to prevent Lady Seris from completing the Eclipse Crown, then so be it. With Sorrowbringer drawn and resolve hardening his heart, Kael Draven began the ascent toward the top of the northwest tower, where Twilight's last hope and darkness's greatest champion awaited. Chapter 7, The Sanctum. 7 spiraling flights of stairs led up the northwest tower, each darker and colder than the last. Kael encountered no guards, no shadow priests, no defensive wards, an absence that spoke not of negligence but supreme confidence. Lady Seris believed her ritual chamber needed no protection beyond its inaccessibility and her own considerable power. Or perhaps she had withdrawn all her forces to participate in the ceremony itself. Kael paused at the final landing, where a pair of doors inlaid with obsidian and silver barred his way. Intricate carvings depicted the phases of the moon, culminating in a total eclipse at the center where the two doors met. Unlike the dungeon entrance, these doors radiated malevolence, a palpable aura of wrongness that made the air itself seem to recoil. No lock, no handle, no visible means of entry. Yet they were clearly meant to open somehow. The starfall stone against his chest had grown painfully hot, its pulsing now a steady, rapid beat that matched the racing of his heart. Acting on instinct, Kael removed the stone from its pouch and pressed it against the eclipse carving. The doors shuddered, then separated with a sound like distant thunder. Beyond lay Lady Seris's sanctum, a vast circular chamber whose domed ceiling had been removed, leaving it open to the crimson sky where the moon hung bloated and malevolent. Kael stepped through the doorway, Sorceress raised. The chamber's floor was a mosaic of black and white tiles arranged in spiraling patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of one's eye. At its center stood a raised dais of polished obsidian, upon which rested a pedestal of twisted silver. Atop the pedestal sat two fragments of the Eclipse Crown, jagged pieces of metal that seemed to absorb the moonlight falling upon them. Around the dais, arranged in a perfect circle, stood 13 shadow priests, their elongated forms unnaturally still. Between them, drawn in what could only be blood, ran a complex series of sigils and runes that pulsed with eldritch energy. And there, directly opposite the entrance, stood Lady Seris Mornweald. She wore a gown of midnight silk that seemed to flow like liquid shadow around her perfect form. Her beauty remained flawless, her skin luminous, her eyes shifting between violet and the deepest indigo as she regarded her uninvited guest. "Kael Draven," she said, her voice like honey poured over ice. "Always the knight, charging in where wiser men would flee. Where is the Blackmere heir?" Kael demanded, advancing slowly into the chamber. Lady Seris smiled, gesturing to her right. "Alistair, do come greet our guest." A young man emerged from the shadows, tall and well-built, with the Blackmere auburn hair and proud features. But his eyes were wrong, black from lid to lid, without whites or irises. He moved with the fluid grace of the shadow priests, though his form remained human. "What have you done to him?" Kael's grip tightened on Sorceress. "Elevated him," Lady Seris replied. "Young Alistair had the honor of being chosen as Umbrafa's vessel. When the crown is complete, he will wear it first, channeling the deity's essence into our realm before passing it to me." "A possession," Kael translated. "You've hollowed him out to make room for your god." A crude characterization, but essentially correct. She circled the dais, trailing her fingers along the pedestal. "Though I'm surprised to see you here, Kael. I thought you'd be halfway to the sanctuary, by now with the other Blackmeres." Cold realization dawned. "You let them escape?" "Of course." Her smile widened. "I needed you occupied while I completed preparations. And I needed them to believe they had a chance. Hope makes the final breaking so much sweeter." Kael's eyes narrowed. "You've been manipulating me from the start." "Not just from the start of this little adventure," Lady Seris corrected. "From the moment I first saw you in the royal court, so earnest, so dedicated to your knightly virtues." She laughed softly. "I knew then that you would be perfect." "Perfect for what?" "For the prophecy, of course." She gestured toward the two crown fragments. "The Eclipse Crown requires the blood of one's most cherished sacrifice. Most practitioners of the old arts try to circumvent this requirement. They convince themselves they love nothing, cherish nothing. But the crown cannot be deceived." She moved closer, her eyes locked with his. "I learned this the hard way. After eliminating every possible attachment in my life, I attempted a preliminary binding ritual with just these two fragments. It rejected me. Violently." For the first time, Kael noticed the faint silvery scars that marred her otherwise perfect hands. "That's when I realized my mistake," she continued. "The crown doesn't want the blood of nothing. It wants genuine sacrifice. The heartbreak of losing something truly precious." Her gaze intensified. "And you, Kael Draven, have exactly what I need." "I have nothing left to lose," he growled, advancing another step. "Oh, but you do." Lady Seris snapped her fingers. From the shadows behind her emerged a figure Kael had not seen in 3 years. A woman with copper hair and eyes the color of summer leaves. A face he had forced himself to forget, to excise from his dreams and memories. "Lyra," he whispered, the name tearing from his throat unbidden. She stood unnaturally still, her expression blank, her once vibrant eyes now dull and unfocused. But it was unmistakably her, Lyra Warden, daughter of the royal physician, the woman Kael had loved since childhood. The woman who had believed the lies about him murdering the prince. The woman who had denounced him publicly, whose testimony had sealed his fate as the betrayer knight. "You're not the only one skilled at keeping people imprisoned," Lady Seris said softly. "Though I prefer to call it preserved. She's been like this since the day of your trial, suspended between life and death, neither aging nor truly living." "Why?" Kael managed through clenched teeth. "Why keep her? Because I saw the way you looked at her, even as she condemned you. The depth of love doesn't die with betrayal, Kael. It transforms, twists, becomes something darker, but it remains. And that's what the crown requires. Not just blood, but blood given in the full knowledge of what you're sacrificing." Kael's vision blurred with rage, and something dangerously close to tears. He had spent 3 years convincing himself that Lyra meant nothing to him anymore, that her betrayal had killed whatever love he once felt. Now, seeing her empty shell standing before him, he realized the cruel truth. He had never stopped loving her, never stopped hoping for a chance to clear his name in her eyes. "You're insane," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "To think I would willingly sacrifice her for your ritual." "Not willingly," Lady Seris corrected. "Not at first. But you will. Because the alternative is to watch as I complete the ritual, using the blood of every Blackmere who fled my dungeons, including little Elise." She gestured to the crimson moon above. "The umbral eclipse approaches its zenith. When it reaches perfect alignment, the crown will awaken fully. All I need is the third fragment, the one you carry." Kael's hand went instinctively to the pocket containing the caged decoy fragment. "You knew. I felt it the moment you entered EVERMIST Keep." The crown pieces called to each other. She held out her hand. "Give it to me, Kael. Give it to me, and I swear Lyra will be released from her trance. She'll live out her days in peace, never knowing what transpired here." "And if I refuse?" Lady Seris's beautiful face hardened. "Then I will take it anyway, and Lyra will die screaming, knowing it was her beloved Kael who failed to save her." Again. Around them, the shadow priests began to sway, their elongated forms undulating like reeds in an unseen wind. The blood sigils on the floor pulsed brighter, their crimson light casting everything in a hellish glow. Kael's mind raced. The fragment in his pocket was a decoy, valuable as a distraction, but useless for the ritual. If he surrendered it, Lady Seris would immediately recognize the deception. If he refused, she would take it by force and still discover the truth. Either way, the outcome was the same, failure. Unless— "You're right," he said slowly, reaching into his pocket. "I do still love her, despite everything." Lady Seris's eyes gleamed with triumph as Kael withdrew the caged fragment. "I knew you would see reason. But you're wrong about one thing," he continued, taking a step toward the dais. "I'm not the man who fails those he loves. Not again." In one fluid motion, Kael hurled the caged fragment, not toward Lady Seris, but directly at the 2 authentic pieces resting on the pedestal. The moment the decoy made contact with its genuine counterparts, a violent reaction erupted. A blinding flash of silver light exploded outward as the fragments recognized the imposter among them. Lady Seris screamed, rage and disbelief contorting her perfect features as she lunged forward. "What have you done?" The shadow priests broke formation, their elongated forms rippling with agitation as the blood sigils beneath them flared and crackled with unstable energy. The ritual circle, meticulously prepared over months, began to collapse. Kael didn't waste the moment of chaos. He sprinted toward Lyra, Sorrowbringer slicing through 2 shadow priests that moved to intercept him. The enchanted blade parted their shadowy forms like smoke, leaving them to dissipate with unearthly wails. "You fool!" Lady Seris shrieked above the mounting cacophony. "You've destabilized the binding. The fragments will tear this tower apart." Indeed, the crown pieces had begun to vibrate with increasing intensity, levitating above the pedestal, spinning faster and faster while emitting pulses of dark energy that cracked the obsidian dais beneath them. Kael reached Lyra, catching her as she collapsed, the mystical stasis that had preserved her beginning to falter as the ritual's power unraveled. Her eyes fluttered, a spark of awareness returning to their green depths. "Kael," she whispered, her voice hoarse from years of disuse. "I've got you," he promised, gathering her in his arms. Across the chamber, Alistair Blackmere, or the thing wearing his form, advanced with inhuman grace, black eyes fixed on Kael. "The vessel must not escape," he intoned, his voice layered with something ancient and cold. "The crown demands completion." Lady Seris had recovered from her shock and now worked frantically to salvage the ritual, her hands weaving complex patterns in the air as she chanted in a language that made the air itself seem to recoil. The remaining shadow priests formed a protective circle around her and the spinning fragments. "We need to leave. Now," Kael told Lyra, supporting her weight as he backed toward the tower door. The starfall stone against his chest pulsed violently, responding to the chaotic energies filling the chamber. But Alistair moved with supernatural speed, cutting off their escape route. "Her blood or yours," he said, drawing a curved dagger of obsidian. "The sacrifice must be completed." Kael gently set Lyra aside, positioning himself between her and the possessed heir. "Lord Blackmere said his son was beyond saving," he said grimly. "I'm sorry." Sorrowbringer flashed blue in the crimson light as Kael lunged forward. Alistair parried with inhuman precision, the obsidian dagger scraping against the enchanted blade with a sound like screaming glass. They exchanged a flurry of blows, Kael's years of knightly training matched against whatever dark entity now inhabited the young nobleman's body. Behind them, Lady Seris's desperate spell-weaving had momentarily stabilized the fragments, though they continued to spin and pulse with malevolent energy. "Bring me the knight's blood," she commanded. Quickly, before the alignment passes, Alistair pressed his attack with renewed vigor, forcing Kael back step by step. Though Kael had faced countless opponents in battle and emerged victorious, he had never encountered one with such unnatural speed and strength. The dagger slipped past his guard, scoring a line of fire across his ribs. Kael stumbled, momentarily off balance, and Alistair seized the advantage, driving the obsidian blade toward his heart, only to be intercepted by Lyra, who threw herself between them with a cry. The dagger plunged into her shoulder instead of Kael's chest. Blood bloomed across her pale gown like an unfurling rose. Alistair hissed in triumph, withdrawing the blade now coated with her blood. "No!" Kael roared, catching Lyra as she fell. But Alistair was already turning, racing back toward Lady Seris with his bloody prize. "The sacrifice," he called. "Freely given to protect another. The crown will accept this." Lady Seris's eyes gleamed with terrible anticipation as she extended her hand for the dagger. "Blood of true sacrifice," she whispered. "The final component." "Lyra, stay with me," Kael pleaded, pressing his hand against her wound to stem the bleeding. "Why did you do that?" Her eyes found his, clearer now despite the pain. "Because I never stopped believing in you," she whispered. "Not really. Even when all evidence pointed to your guilt, my heart knew better." On the dais, Lady Seris raised the bloodied dagger high, preparing to let Lyra's blood fall upon the spinning fragments. The crimson moon reached its zenith directly above the open dome, bathing the chamber in baleful light. Kael acted on pure instinct. His hand closed around the starfall stone, tearing it from his neck. Without fully understanding why, he hurled it toward the dais with all his strength. The stone struck the spinning fragments at the exact moment Lady Seris completed her incantation. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then light, blinding, purifying light erupted from the starfall stone as it made contact with the crown pieces. The chamber filled with a sound beyond hearing, a cosmic note that vibrated through bone and soul. Lady Seris screamed, a sound of rage and disbelief as the carefully orchestrated ritual transformed into something entirely unexpected. The shadow priests disintegrated in the overwhelming light, their forms unable to withstand its purity. Alistair collapsed to his knees. Black eyes rolled back in his head as whatever entity had possessed him was forcibly expelled. It rose above him like a plume of dark smoke, writhing and shrieking before being sucked toward the maelstrom of energy at the chamber's center. The spinning fragments and starfall stone had formed a perfect trinity, their combined power creating a vortex that drew in all shadow, all darkness. Lady Seris fought against its pull, her beautiful form beginning to unravel like a tapestry caught in a storm. "This isn't possible," she shrieked, her voice distorting. "The prophecy was mine to fulfill." "Perhaps," Kael called above the roar of energy, "you misinterpreted which sacrifice the crown truly required." As if in answer, the stone and fragments exploded in a final burst of radiance. The force of it blasted outward, shattering the tower's remaining walls and exposing the chamber fully to the night sky. But instead of falling, the broken stones hung suspended in midair, caught in the aftermath of cosmic forces unleashed. And where Lady Seris had stood moments before, nothing remained but a swirl of ashes that scattered on the suddenly calm breeze. The crimson moon above began to fade, returning to its natural silver hue. The eclipse was ending. Kael turned his attention back to Lyra, cradling her head. "Stay with me," he urged, tearing strips from his cloak to bind her wound. "It's over now. We're safe." Her eyes fluttered open, focus returning. "Did we win?" she asked weakly. "Yes," he affirmed, helping her sit up carefully, though I'm not entirely sure how. A groan from nearby drew their attention. Alistair Blackmere was stirring, his eyes no longer the solid black pools of possession, but normal human eyes, dazed and confused. "Where am I?" he asked, voice rough. "What happened?" "A long story," Kael replied, "which we'll tell you on the way to the sanctuary. Your father and sister are waiting." Lyra leaned against Kael, her strength slowly returning. "The betrayer knight," she said softly. "I spent 3 years believing you capable of murder. 3 years hating myself for loving you still. And I spent 3 years trying to forget you," he admitted. "Neither of us succeeded, it seems." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps that's our punishment. And our redemption." With careful movements, Kael helped both Lyra and Alistair to their feet. The tower's stairwell had largely survived intact, offering them a path down and away from the devastated ritual chamber. As they began their descent, Kael cast one final glance back at the wreckage. Where the pedestal had stood, a small point of light hovered, neither the starfall stone nor the crown fragments, but something new. Something transformed by their union. For a moment, he considered retrieving it. Then wisdom prevailed. Some powers were best left undisturbed, especially by those who had witnessed their terrible potential firsthand. "What will you do now?" Lyra asked as they made their slow way down the spiral stairs. "After we reach the sanctuary?" Kael considered the question. For 3 years, vengeance had consumed him, the need to clear his name and expose Lady Seris's treachery. Now, with her destruction and the thwarting of her plans, that driving purpose had been fulfilled. "I don't know," he admitted. "For the first time since my exile, the future is an open question." "Then perhaps," she suggested cautiously, "we could discover the answer together." Above them, the night sky had cleared completely, stars glittering like distant hopes against the darkness. And if one particular star seemed to shine with a familiar blue light, reminiscent of Sorrowbringer's edge, well, that was a mystery for another day. For now they had survived. They had prevailed. And in a world where shadows had nearly triumphed, that small victory was enough to light their way forward. Epilogue: Ashes and Embers. The Sanctuary of Ashes lived up to its name. Ancient stone structures, half reclaimed by the whispering forest, created a maze of quiet contemplation where the wounded nobles of VEYRATH's oldest houses found refuge and healing. Lord Blackmere, reunited with both his children, had begun the slow process of recovery, both physical and spiritual. The strange shadow marks burned into his skin were gradually fading, though the memory of his ordeal would likely never fully disappear. Elise had appointed herself her father's primary caretaker, bringing him herbal teas prepared by the sanctuary's healers and reading to him from the library's vast collection of histories and poems. Her small face remained solemn, aged beyond her years by what she had witnessed, but occasional smiles broke through, especially when her brother joined them. Alistair Blackmere remembered little of his possession. Brief flashes of darkness, whispered promises of power, fragments of ancient knowledge that slipped away like water through cupped hands. The sanctuary's elder priests assured him this amnesia was a blessing rather than a curse. Kael found the young heir one morning standing at the sanctuary's highest point, gazing eastward toward distant EVERMIST Keep, or what remained of it. Reports from travelers suggested the fortress had collapsed entirely, its stones scattered as if by a giant's tantrum, leaving only the foundations as testament to its once imposing presence. "I keep thinking I should feel something," Alistair confessed. "Guilt, relief, even fear. But there's just emptiness. The entity that possessed you took something from you," Kael replied. "But it left space for something new to grow." The young nobleman considered this. "My father wishes to return to Blackmere Manor as soon as he's able to travel. He wants us to rebuild what was lost. And you? I'm not sure I'm fit to be anyone's heir anymore," Alistair said quietly. "Not after being used, as I was." Kael placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder. Sometimes those who have faced the darkness directly are best equipped to recognize its approach. He paused. "VEYRATH will need leaders who understand the threat that nearly consumed it." "Is it truly over?" Alistair asked. "Lady Seris, the shadow priests, the crown fragments, all destroyed?" Kael's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where the starfall stone had once rested. "Transformed, perhaps. But their threat, at least, has ended." They stood in companionable silence as the morning mist began to burn away beneath the rising sun. Somewhere in the sanctuary below, life continued. Wounds healing, plans forming, relationships mending and forming anew. Lyra had integrated herself among the sanctuary's healers, her knowledge of herbs and medicines, learned from her father, the royal physician, making her an invaluable addition to their ranks. Her wound had healed cleanly, leaving only a small crescent scar on her shoulder. She and Kael had spoken little of the future. Both understood that some foundations needed careful reconstruction before anything lasting could be built upon them. Trust, like faith, required time and tending. But they had time now. The immediate threat had passed. The 12 noble houses were regrouping. Messengers dispatched to the capital with news of Lady Seris's treachery and demise. Without her shadow influence at court, the truth of Prince Aldric's murder would finally emerge. Kael's name would be cleared, his honor restored. The title of Betrayer Knight would fade into history, replaced perhaps by some new moniker that celebrated his role in stopping the umbral eclipse ritual. Yet he found himself increasingly indifferent to such concerns. Reputation, position, the regard of nobility. These seemed hollow prizes compared to the simple peace he had discovered in the sanctuary's quiet halls, or the warmth of Lyra's smile when their eyes met across a crowded room. "What will you do?" Alistair asked, echoing Lyra's question from days earlier. "When all this settles, when you're no longer a fugitive, but a hero." Kael smiled faintly. "Heroes are rarely comfortable in times of peace. I might not be suited for whatever world emerges from these events." "I think you underestimate yourself," the younger man replied, "and your capacity for change." Below them, the sanctuary bell tolled, calling residents to the morning meal. Alistair excused himself, leaving Kael alone with his thoughts and the brightening day. From his vantage point, he could see a lone figure in the herb garden, Lyra, gathering ingredients for her healing work. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up, shading her eyes against the sun. When she spotted him, she raised a hand in greeting. Kael returned the gesture, a strange lightness expanding in his chest where the Starfall stone had once rested. Perhaps Alistair was right. Perhaps he had underestimated his capacity for change, for growth beyond the identities that had defined and confined him. Betrayer Knight, exile, avenger. Perhaps, in the end, being simply Kael Draven would be enough. As he descended the path toward the sanctuary proper, toward Lyra and whatever future awaited them both, he found himself recalling an old VEYRATH proverb. From the ashes of what was, the embers of what could be are born. The Eclipse Crown was no more. Lady Seris was defeated. The shadows had receded. And in their absence, possibility remained, fragile as an ember, bright as hope. The end,